there was that the, the definition, well, there isn't a definition for open space. There's another definition there. And there was a discussion, I mentioned that we had this on our agenda. And the agreement there was that we would take this issue, cover it, and then I would bring back whatever our kind of thoughts were from this committee. So if that committee had additional thoughts that they wanted to add, they could.
Right.
I think that sounds spot on.
Okay.
So,
So do you want to do the open space today, or do you want to, I mean, I guess we've got minutes.
I see Melanie nodding, and I think it would be good. I mean, I think whatever we do here in this committee is going to require integrating several different topics. And so I don't mind putting pause on all the great stuff that Melanie had underway and just hearing from you about open space. We were talking about open space a fair amount the last time. So I think it would be great to get into it.
Okay.
And I think it also ties back into the stuff Melanie's been talking about. So
Right.
I think holistically it makes sense.
Absolutely.
It's like one component of what Melanie's covering,
Yeah,
but especially
big one
because
too.
the committee is moving ahead. I think if we can kind of do our job on this, this will help them too. So what I did was I put together a document to kind of guide our discussion, and I think Janelle's going to bring that up now. And we can go to the next page. It's the open space discussion document. I thought it was worthwhile to take us back to kind of where we started this committee, which was saying that we are going to be reviewing annexation issues relative to looking at the purposes that are stated in 197 43.1, and also looking at what the comp plan had said. So just to bring us back, I've tried to just do a really short summary. So this isn't word for word everything that every word that is stated in the purposes. So I've kind of done a little shortening of it. The purposes are to provide opportunities for residential development. And I think open space, no matter how we do that, should be providing opportunities for that. But then secondly, to conserve open land and environmentally sensitive areas, to provide development options that minimize impacts on sensitive environmental resources, reduce disturbance of natural and cultural features, and conserve scenic views, and then provide design flexibilities. Now on the right, I've pulled out from 197-50 things that I thought were relevant to each of these objectives. So in terms of conserving open land and environmentally sensitive areas, currently our open space code requires that 30% of open land be adjacent to existing or planned open areas such as public parks, wetlands, and preserved open areas. So I raised this, I think it's important to kind of look at that, especially as we think of some developments that might have the open land in the center of them. This might make that more challenging for that kind of design. On the other hand, we may want to say we really want to have open space adjacent to other open space to make it an even larger open area. Now,
Nancy, can I just stop you there for a second? I mean, I think one of the ongoing challenges, I would put that whole problem as a pattern problem, right? How does this piece of open space fit with all the surrounding open space? And how can it do more by being connected to surrounding open space? And of course, in there is a thing about plans. And of course, that's all fluid, right? Everything's changing through time. So it would be great if we had some great comprehensive plan for open space. Janelle, I'm not under the impression that we have such a thing. It would sort of go across all the property of the city as well as, between the properties of the cities. Do we have such a thing?
I think the closest we have, not a plan per se, but we do have all the property that's zoned open space. So we can see the connections there, which I think is, we definitely want to encourage that. But yeah, I'm not aware of an existing plan. I can reach out to the parks administrator and see if they have anything, but I think it's just, each park has a plan, but I don't think there's a holistic open space plan for the city.
Okay, because I
And
mean, I think
keep in
that's,
mind, everything I'm saying about open space here is referring to the open space requirement within, if you're looking at AX res or, we're not talking about large tracts that are zoned open space. Okay.
right.
So
Thank
then
you.
in terms of providing development options that minimize impacts on sensitive areas, 197-50.C3 says that 30% of the open space cannot contain any wetlands. And the whole purpose in number 3 here that addresses natural and cultural features or scenic views isn't really, I couldn't really find addressed in any way in what we have right now. Then the last one, design flexibility. Keep in mind that currently the criteria that are provided in the design of open spaces provide for flexibility, but describe the open spaces that are going to be developed as created as being permanent, contiguous, 30% usable. There is no definition of usable. Adjacent to other open spaces, as I mentioned, that there be some dedication and commitment to maintain them, and that there are situations in which trails and pathways would be counted in those open spaces, and just a few uses excluded. So I'm just trying to level set what we have right now and how it matches when we think of reviewing it against that set of purposes. If we can go to the next one. So this is doing the same thing, but looking at it against the comprehensive plan. So the comp plan open space policy and recommendations specifically recommend using open space requirements in the subdivision ordinance to align the open spaces between adjacent developments to maximize open space. And currently we do have a criteria in 197 that's consistent with that recommendation. In terms of protecting environmentally sensitive areas, the comp plan supports the use of regulations to protect these areas. The current regulations only address this in terms of when discussing open areas, they have the requirement that 30% of the open space be usable and not contain any wetlands. So it was a little bit harder to do a crosswalk against this objective stated in the comprehensive plan and what we have now. So I'm raising these just to kind of, again, set the scene as we look at open space, what the comp plan says and what our what the current purposes state. So
The first question that comes to mind is what does usable mean? How do we make that mean something?
Yeah.
That everybody can understand.
And I'm going to come to that and look at how other jurisdictions define usable. Okay. So, open space, we currently have no definition of it. We do have a definition of open areas, and, we may want to consider that equivalent. And they're defined as land or water other than lots, streets, and sidewalks set aside by the developer and so arranged to permit ingress, egress, or passage over or through the area. Now, keep in mind, when I read this, I'm reading it not as what, if we think back to Melanie's presentation, what we might think of as an open area that would be really used by a community, not simply to walk or travel between areas or enter or leave an area, but an area that could be used for recreation, you know, getting together with people, you know, whatever you might, however you might want to use open space. So our current open area definition focuses very much on ingress, egress, passage over and through the area, as opposed to when we're talking about some subdivisions or developments where we're thinking of that as being an area that people would use for communal activities. Just as a side note, MNCC ranked the action item when we looked at that list of action items, and the action item of open space as a high priority, and commented, completely agree. It should be easy, just amend the definition. So happy to hear there's
We're
an
gonna get it
easy
done right
task
now.
ahead of us.
We're gonna get it done right now.
Okay, if we go to the next slide. So I looked at other definitions of open space, and the open space development model ordinance that the EPA provides defines defines 3 different types of space relative to open space, green space, and community open space. So open space they define as a portion of a development site that is permanently set aside for public or private use and will not be developed. Open space may be used as community open space or preserved as green space. And then green space is open space maintained in a natural, undisturbed, or revegetated condition. And then community open space is the area of open space remaining after natural open space has been designated. The area may be used for passive or active recreation. This should be or stormwater management. So these are just some definitions that have been proposed by the EPA. We move to the next slide. So what I thought we should just, really focus on today is, first of all, should the code include a definition of open spaces? Do we think the current code sufficiently addresses the stated purposes of conserving lands that contain unique resources such as woodlands and reducing disturbance of natural and cultural features and conserving scenic views? And then should open space be usable? And if so, how are we defining usability? How much of it should be usable? And are more criteria needed to ensure a level of usability? And then fourth, does the current code provide sufficient protection of environmentally sensitive areas? Now, I kind of doubt we'll be able to get through all of these today. But the next thing I did was I went to various jurisdictions and just looked at how others have defined open space in their code, how others have defined usability. And I should say, with reference to usability, it appeared to me that many, in a sense, are functionally defining usability in terms of how they describe what gets counted as open space. So they don't always have a definition of usability, but the code may make statements about access to the open space, what can be in that open space, what you can build on it, whether a playground, etc. So the things that I think, if I look across all of those various, this is like internet searching in some ways, randomly looking at how other jurisdictions define this and look at things that they included in their definitions. I tried to make a list of factors to consider. One is how you delineate the open space, whether in order to be counted as open space, the slope of it has to be a certain slope, or the dimensions of it need to be a certain size. Then what can be included in the open space? So if we're talking about things like stormwater management, whether that can or can't be included, whether the paths can or can't be included. In some cases, whether roads can or can't be included. And then some have a set of exclusions of things that cannot be included in open space or cannot be constructed or built on that open space. Then the fourth factor that many mention is accessibility, and whether that accessibility is for the general public or just for residents of a subdivision or area. Many have specific uses that are either permitted or excluded. And then finally, most make some comment on ownership and maintenance of the open space. So what I've done is for each of these headings, again, looking at what people have put in their codes. If we go to the next one, I've done like a bulleted sublist under each of these of things that we might want to discuss and consider when we're thinking about open space. So if I begin first with just the delineation of open space, some have minimum dimension or minimum area or a minimum ratio. So what they seem to be, what I think they're trying to address here is if your open space is 1 foot wide and, a gazillion feet long, unless you have very skinny people using it, it probably isn't really usable open space. And the 3 different ways they try to address that issue, in some cases, they'll say no minimum dimension of the open space can be less than, X feet. Others come at it from saying the minimum square area needs to be a certain number. And others yet come at it from the ratio to between the width and the length. So second area in terms of delineating the open space, some say that no slope in the open space can be greater than a certain amount. I'll editorialize a little bit here. Having lived in Canada for many years, having an open space with a given slope for sledding was always a big plus. So, it's all in how you want to use that open space. Then the third thing is whether there's ready accessibility of the open space. The concern being if only a small number of houses or townhouses at a development kind of surround an open space, it really isn't accessible to everyone in that development, nor is it accessible to the public. And then adjacency, whether it needs to be contiguous with adjacent open areas or greenways. So let me stop here just so we can talk about what we think about how open space should be defined just in terms of dimension and size.
So just a couple of general thoughts first. I mean, just first of all, thank you. This is excellent information. It's got a lot of ideas pinging around in my little brain right now, but that last slide that you just showed got me thinking about some sort of a scorecard type approach. Building on the conversations that we've had so far about providing flexibility, providing incentives. I think there are different ways of, for lack of a better metaphor, skinning this cat here. I think, we need to be able to be flexible in terms of how open space may work in a given parcel, as long as it meets the goals and whatever those goals need to be. I think in some places, in some locations in the landscape of Lewis, the ability to connect to what I imagine will be adjacent greenways, adjacent green spaces, may very well offer opportunities that may constrain how the open space works on that property, but the value of it being connected in the bigger system will be worthwhile versus another site that may be completely isolated from the bigger system, if you will, where having enough open space on that site may become more important. I'm thinking out loud here, but to me, it seems like there's there's a way that we should be able to build in some flexibility that allows the context of a site to be factored in. But the usability has always been the question, if that's the term, maybe it was accessibility. For whom is this open space being built? Is it simply for the residents of a given community, or is it for the residents of the broader city of Lewis, and so on? I'll stop talking.
Well, I think the dimensional requirement is interesting. I think the minimum width is very important. I'm not sure about the other criteria though, the minimum area or the ratio, because, for example, there's a property with a 30-foot required buffer from the adjacent property, and they're calling that open space. Well, the dimension may be, 1,000 feet long and might not meet a ratio requirement, but for all practical purposes, it is open space. So I would think the most important issue there is the width, the minimum width requirement.
And I should say, most pick one of these. They wouldn't have all of them defined. It's hard for me. I mean, let's say it's easy for me to imagine a width which is meaningless in terms of open space.
Right.
Whether it's contiguous or not contiguous, if you're adding 1 foot on to some other open space, it's not really meaningful.
Right. But is 5 feet meaningful?
But the question is, how much is meaningful?
Yeah.
And how is it being used? Because maybe that 5 feet, well, I think 5 feet's a little small because that's just the width of a sidewalk. But, if we say 10 feet's, the minimum, how is that being used? And I've worked a lot of places where it's like you have an open space, and I know you talked about usable. And most places I've worked have had like, this is an active and passive, but you brought up the green space and the community open space. And it's like, okay, well, your green spaces, would be like your wetlands or your woodlands. And, that's green space. You're not touching that. It's all open space, but you're not touching that. But then you have your community open space, which could be your walking path, gazebo, pool, clubhouse, playground area. And I think that if you use either of those sets of words, then you've taken care of usable. And then you can just kind of put descriptives of what you want to allow, not allow. And I would encourage that in neither of them would you count the roads or the right of way, because that's really not open space. But you might, let like stormwater management ponds, waterways, landscape buffers all fall into open space. But I think that's more the green open space, but you need to have some ratio proportion of that community open space, because I think that's what you just got my head spinning. It's like, oh, I like the different verbiage, just to make sure we're getting both, but with the understanding that I think what we were talking last time is, you might get a small 6-lot, 7-lot subdivision where none of this makes sense. So some abilities for them to be creative, because, a clubhouse pool may not be feasible and they might not have any, a lot of open space. So I think that's where we get into Melanie's flexibility and some creativity to try and find that balance.
So can,
one of the
given the
things
size differences,
sorry, I had a question for Janelle. One of the things that some of them say is that the setbacks do not count towards open space. And I thought that was true in the way it's currently applied, but I just wanted to ask you that, Janelle.
That would be correct.
Okay.
So, and I think that's where, so it's like the right of way. I think what we want to do is get the right of way out, and there's green space in the right of way, but that's really not open space. And then I think that they're talking about, you know, your front yard or your backyard is not open space. That's your yard, that you can actually close in.
What about that buffer from adjoining property? That's really a setback, but I think that should be included in the open space.
Agreed. It's some type of open space, because usually, like we're looking at one, if it's adjacent to agricultural, you have to have a 30-foot wide landscape buffer. So that should be, to me, in like the green space, open space. That's your passive, but it counts towards open space. It's not really going to be functional, because that intent is not for it to be functional. That is to provide a buffer. Or sometimes, you know, your buffer could be that wetland and wetland buffer, because that's your green open space. You want that protected, you know? So that is definitely open space. It's, you know, how much of that community open space, that active, do you want? And I know, you were, and then I'm going to skip to accessibility. I actually asked somebody, I was like, okay, you've got a picnic table out in the middle of nowhere. How's somebody in a wheelchair getting there? So they provided a path to it, because it was like, that's nice, but, you know, just like, if you know, somebody can't get to it, who needs that? Or, you know, they're on crutches, but they want to go hang out at the picnic table. Walking on grass isn't like the best thing for them. So I know when I do my review, I try to make sure that, you know, some things are accessible, but I think getting that into the code to like get people to think about it is wonderful.
Hey, we have a comment from Joe, and I just want to make clear that we are not talking about the zoned open spaces. So if you want to think of that, Joe, as lowercase, yeah. We're talking about open space requirements within AX Res or AX Mix. And in the end, this is also a discussion that will have an impact on just the subdivision discussion too.
The other one I'd like to talk about is the slope requirement. I really think that's for areas that have slope issues. And I don't think we have that here. I think we're, for the most part, the land here is flat. So I don't think we have to worry about slope being part of the definition.
Well, okay, so I guess stormwater basins, all the stormwater practices are not calculated as open space, because of course those can get kind of steep.
Yes.
And unusable, I would argue.
I have an issue with stormwater management anyway. You know, I remember something that we reviewed several months ago that had a series of rectangular stormwater management ponds that were, you know, counted towards their open space requirement, and yet they were totally unusable. You know, the side slopes were pretty steep, and then they had, you know, these natural bottoms that will probably be mucky or whatever, but they certainly, I consider stormwater management infrastructure for the subdivision. And I don't think that at least the bottom surface of a pond should be included in open space.
Well, and I think it comes to something that Janelle was saying earlier, and Nancy's definition, I think, came from the EPA. There's the green space thing, and then there's the community piece. I know there's a third one that I'm forgetting, but you know, it gets to my simple way of doing this is: can a kid play ball in it? Right? If it's something that's nothing more than the visual, some sort of, you know, pretty thing that you can look at, but you can't touch, you know, there's only so much good that comes from that. There is value in scenic vistas, and they should be a part of it, but they shouldn't be the only thing. As I think Janelle was getting at, we need to be able to have places where people can walk and engage with the landscape and sit down and, you know, picnic or whatever they're going to do. And I think of those stormwater practices as not being places where those kinds of things can happen. So
I've seen them.
I thought
Do we don't have, where are we with that? Because I felt the same way Melanie did when we were going through that proposal before. You know, what can and can't be done with stormwater practices and counting toward open space right now?
So my understanding right now is they can count towards open space, but I think what we're trying to do is delineate between, you know, a green space, which I think a stormwater management pond would, or woodlands. You're pretty to look at, you're not really touching it, you can't do it, versus our community open space, our active open space, which is I've got a walking path, I've got, you know, a pickleball court, I've got something else that is more active. And I've actually seen it in other places. Well, it's like your stormwater management counts towards open space, but it doesn't count towards your active open space. So they would literally count the walking path that goes around it, because a lot of places will put a walking path around the ponds, because usually you get birds there, you get ducks there, you get fish. I've seen people fish in them. The pond doesn't count towards that active, but the sidewalk or the walking path around it does. So you don't get to count it twice, and you don't get to count it towards your active. And I think that's the big thing here, is that we really need to find that distinguishing. We need to distinguish that. You know, it's like, okay, if it's going to be part of open space, I don't think we want to count it towards. And what I'm getting is, I think what we want to do is come up with those three definitions: is open space, and then we have that green space, that passive open space, and then we have that community open space, that active open space, and then figure out what goes in each of them, and then say, okay, well, you have to have at least 30% active community open space in a development, you know. And I'm just throwing numbers out there, you know.
And I should say, when I was looking at the way different folks wrote these, write these ordinances, oftentimes you would see that stormwater management pools or basins that have been built do not count. Now, if you're, and I think they specifically weren't just saying stormwater management practices, because you may have a gentle swale that's leading to something, and, you know, that can be used. And, you know, I in an extreme storm, well, in an extreme storm, we probably aren't playing outside, but but they distinguished that from a kind of natural pond, or something that's being preserved by the open space. So that's just another way of people make that distinction.
And I understand where Melanie's coming from, but I think we also have to remember, could that be considered a carrot to get somebody to want to annex in? If we say, because I think if we say you can't count your stormwater management, it's considered infrastructure. To me, I could see that as a big red flag, as nobody's going to want to come in and annex, because they can't count their stormwater management even as, you know, a passive green open space. That means then they could be losing lots, doing other things that could be a significant impact for them, and when they can go elsewhere and it gets counted. So I think, you know, I'm not disagreeing, I'm just putting that out there, because I think the intent is we're trying to figure out ways to get what we want, but also encourage people to want to annex. And I can just see that if we're going to call that infrastructure, I could see that as a big red flag of people not wanting to come in.
So are you imagining some sort of ratio, some, sort of perfect ratio of passive, active, green space? I mean, do you think that really works across the scales where we might have properties? And I don't mean location wise, I mean size wise. I mean, 10% active space, 15% passive, whatever. I don't know the numbers, but I mean, are you imagining something like that, Janelle?
Yeah, I think you can definitely put a percentage. Or I've seen it where you put so many square footage of that active community open space per residential unit. So it's like, okay, I need so many, okay, and I'm just throwing out numbers, like 50 square feet for every house or 100 square feet. You can do something like that, or you can just say, all right, I think right now 30% of your lot has to be open space. Of that, we want 30% of that to be active or community open space. I mean, you can just play with the numbers and see what you think makes sense.
Melanie, you had something you wanted to say. I cut you off.
No, I think what Janelle just said was probably the right way to go. The question is, what are the percents that we like? We probably need to look at some subdivisions and see what really worked well and perhaps what failed to work well.
So for the sake of argument, Janelle, you just gave an example of, the need to be thinking about incentivizing annexation into the city and not, putting up red flags. How would you honor the sort of three-part open space definition that we're sort of talking about here, given that we don't want to disincentivize the stormwater thing? I'm just trying to play that out.
So I think we're looking at like potentially 3 definitions. One is overall open space and the intent for a development, for what we want is the land that's not considered lots nor right of way, which actually that could be a red flag, but I'm more comfortable with that red flag because like really roads are not right of or open space. And then coming up with a definition of, that green space and community open space, calling them out and then saying, okay, so like if we have a 10-acre parcel, right now code says 3 acres because 30% has to be open space. And then of those 3 acres, 30% has to be some type of community open space, active open space. So like a walking path, a gazebo, like a gathering place. I think we also need to recognize that it might just be a gathering place, a fire pit, because we're talking, and again, my example was 10 acres. Not a whole lot. I mean, you're not building a pool, you're not building a pickleball court or a basketball court or tennis court, but, is there, can I connect to the bike trail, so that could count. Could I do a couple of benches in a fire pit, which could be a nice little gathering place? Is 30% of 30% good, or do we want to encourage more activity? I think we also then need to also find that flexibility, because we might find parcels that have a lot of floodplain or wetlands or woodlands, and we definitely want that protected. So maybe that takes up more open space than we want, which leaves them a little bit less for that active, but maybe they can connect to the bike trail, or they can connect to a city park. And I think it's trying to find that balance, and I'm not sure how we do that one, but I think we have to, I know you guys want to find that flexibility and that creativeness, and I think we have to be open to those types of ideas.
The other thing that occurs to me is, in terms of incentivizing, is that if the subdivision has some really special recreational feature that perhaps we can put the percentage down lower, and make that an incentive. So if you create this central meeting place for the community, maybe rather than 30%, you can go down to 25, or some proportion like that. So if the developer spends a little bit more and makes a special place, we give him an incentive for that.
So I like that. That's sort of where I was about to go. After what Janelle just said, I kind of feel like some of that flexibility and incentivizing should come from being able to couple what we've talked about in the last couple of meetings with what we're talking about today. How can we, incentivize sort of good open space by providing perhaps higher density and some of the other things we were talking about in the last meeting or two. So I just want to keep that in mind, that I don't think any of these issues works perfectly in isolation in terms of trying to be sensitive to the site and what the natural landscape provides and how it constrains development. This is why I said the thing I said a little while ago about a scorecard. And Melanie, what you just said, it in the back of my mind as you were talking, I was thinking some way of having a way of scoring things, of being able to, tally up all these different aspects of the plan, because every site's going to be different.
Yeah.
We're not going to be able to, I guess my worry is that we're going to try to impose some perfect ratio. That's not quite why I asked Janelle the question a few minutes ago, this perfect ratio of this kind of open space versus that kind of open space. And my worry is that then what we get is these cute little spaces that are totally isolated from the rest of the pattern, the context to this given site. And my hope, at least, is that whatever open space scheme we've got here also fits into the bigger pattern of the lands around the given parcel. So yeah, I couldn't pretend to offer that up today. I frankly am intrigued by everything that you've put together here, Nancy. I know I personally am going to need to sort of think about this and sort of chew on it and look around some.
Let me say, I think that today, at least my objective was that we have kind of a structured discussion about all these aspects. And that whether we're at that point that Janelle can take this away and come back with something that tries to address it, hopefully in some areas we'll be there, but in others we may need to still, continue to look and discuss. But if I can just summarize what I think our discussion has been to date on just defining the open space, it's that we think there should be a minimum dimension to space that's going to be considered open space, that we're leaning towards thinking of having a percentage, listing a percentage of open space for the lot or for the thing. And that within that, we would have a percentage, a minimum, I'm thinking maybe a minimum percentage that would be community and a minimum percentage that would be green. And those minimums would be considerably less than what the total is. So it gives people that room to shift. Well, we're really, we have a plot of land where there's just breathtaking green space that we want to preserve. So, and, we're not going to have we'd rather have more of that preserved than have a big community space, but we still want to have some community space. And so you give that flexibility. Then I think we are saying that the buffer should be excluded from open space, because the purpose of that is a totally different purpose than what we're talking about open space, especially the buffer that's required for adjacent agricultural land, for example. Okay. That I'm hearing so far that we like the idea of adjacency, but it all has to do with the lot and what there is adjacent to it. And we do want to encourage connectivity. So if there are walking paths, we don't want to have little separate walking circles on different plots of land. We would like to have those connected up. And then finally, that we don't think a stormwater retention pool should ever be considered within a percentage that's considered community usable. Now, in a minute, when I come to the other sections, there are going to be more things that I have listed about things that people exclude or whatnot. But let me just take the temperature. Does that seem like a fair summary of where we're at so far in this?
I think it does.
Well, but I thought we decided that a buffer area should be included in open space.
In the open space, like not the community open
Not the
space,
community
but the green open space.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, so question about that. When you read that EPA definition earlier, I thought I saw something about undisturbed. And so one of the questions I had was, so I run the bulldozers over the whole site, but when I'm done, I create this buffer, this not to be touched green space, but it's regraded from the way it was. It's not the way it was when we walked onto the site at the beginning. I mean, is newly created passive quote green space the same as undisturbed green space?
Well, I would never say it was exactly the same because it's not.
Right.
But their definition for green space says open space maintained in a natural, undisturbed. Okay, so that would maintain natural, comma, undisturbed, which is another category, or revegetated condition. So your land that someone's put a bulldozer over, but they've replanted stuff there would be the revegetated condition.
Yeah, because if you think about it, most subdivisions, they're going to have to do a lot of grading just to be able to get utilities in and other things. So they try to save the trees they can, especially if it's a code requirement. But a lot of times, just to get the grading in, they have to, unfortunately, remove some items. But then once you plant back, then you've got your open space. So you're reclaiming it.
Nancy, the other thing I think we should add is that possible incentivization for a special facility
Yes.
in the open space.
Yeah.
What fits under the special facility?
Well, this a central community meeting place, or
So you're talking like the fire pit?
yeah.
Fire
Okay.
pit, the playground, the gazebo,
Okay.
Yeah, and I think we're gonna have to, maybe we don't put that in code. We put like some guidelines together as to superior design for community open space. Because if you meet these criteria, then maybe that percentage can come down.
Get you something, yeah.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that
So-
have to be in the code though?
No, we can reference guidelines.
So this is why I've
Do
been
that with
trying to
5G.
Yeah.
This is why I've been why I keep bringing up the scorecard thing. I'm trying to imagine being in a planning commission meeting and, the next big annexation, major subdivision comes forward. How do we figure out if we've got what we're looking for, if it's good enough and so on? I just feel like there's a lot of things here. So how do we weigh this and whether it's done the job?
Yeah, it seems to me that I feel like if we can get through this discussion in terms of what we would like and what we want to see, then it becomes almost another discussion of, are we putting it in the code? Are we putting it in guidelines? Are we doing a scorecard? Are we doing like a trade-off thing where, pick 4 from this side and you get 2 on that side? Then we can do that. But
okay. So you're saying basically, what are our aspirations? What are we really looking for?
yeah.
Okay.
And the next area was accessibility. And I mean, I would think by definition, we want community open space to be accessible. Otherwise, it's just a community of birds using it, maybe, I don't know.
What about the question about, I find myself, and maybe it's just me being boneheaded as I typically am, but you know, in these major subdivisions where the city is taking on the streets and utilities, you know, as soon as the streets become public, I always find myself wondering, well, are there opportunities for what I'll call little parklets to be part of a broader citywide network of parks? And maybe I'm just dreaming, but
Well,
yeah.
I think a whole nother issue is are you saying that there should be accessibility by the public, or is it just by people who live in the community? And
That's always been a question for me is are we strictly always working on what works for this new homeowners association or civic association and no one else? Or are there opportunities to be engaging the citizens of this community as well as citizens from neighboring communities, you know, in some space that's appropriate?
Mhm.
I'm not
So-
sure I want to legislate this, but I guess I'm wondering if there isn't an opportunity to create some value around that.
So there is an option in the code that somebody could donate or turn over the open space to the city that could then be open to the public. But that's going to be up to the developer. I think you could encourage it, but you cannot mandate it. I think that that's a little tougher. Now, if it stays with the HOA, it is open to the HOA members and their guests because it's their land. They are paying for it, they are maintaining it. So it's finding that balance. Like, you know, you can definitely encourage, you know, and I think that's also a conversation that has to be, you can encourage it, but then it's going to have to run through the Parks and Recreation Commission to see if they actually even want it and if it makes sense for them. Because if we're talking about, you know, just a walking path and some stormwater management ponds and a couple of benches and gazebos, maybe that's not what they see. Their vision for an overall open space, capital O, capital S, Joe, versus the subdivision open space for them. So I think it's just trying to find that balance. And I know you were talking about a scorecard, and I think we need to actually get some guidelines. Once we figure out these three definitions, get some guidelines, because my vision is probably different than yours, which is different than Melanie's, which is different than Nancy's. So it's like, okay, so if we all get to the understanding, like, this is what creates superior criteria, then you can reduce that. You have to have that buy-in, because if we just say, oh, superior, well, what does that mean? And you know, so you have to find some kind of guidance to do that.
Let me maybe backtrack. What do you get for being superior?
I thought we were talking about a reduction in the requirement for overall active recreation or community open space or overall open space if they were giving us something of a much higher quality.
Okay, I missed that. Sorry.
I don't know what other incentive to offer. I mean, if somebody thinks of another incentive, I love it.
yeah, I don't want to say we're short on incentives and long on requirements, but it can feel that way sometimes.
Right,
And again, I think that,
and to me, that's part of this whole thing. I mean, Janelle has been reminding us of how important it is that we not disincentivize in the annexation areas. So my sense is we need to find ways of shortening that list of requirements and lengthening that list of, you know, opportunities.
well, and you guys have been mentioning flexibility, so I think that just adds an extra level of flexibility to get that creative.
I think the way we do this can build in some flexibility, and I think the more specific we are, and things that should be easy to attain, you know, like, I don't think we're going to have a minimum dimension that is so gigantic that would be hard to achieve, but stating it makes it easier to know how you need to plan. In terms of accessibility, though, for the walking paths, are we not able to say that, like, if we have a walking path that connects up with another walking path, can that community put a little gate up and say, you know, you can only walk across, you know, this acre if you.
They shouldn't, especially if the intent, it's like, think of it as a stub street. The intent of a
Yeah.
sub street is that it's going to connect through. Most sidewalks and paths are kind of looping in somewhere, so they're not typically stubbing somewhere. But I think that's something that you can definitely encourage, is that connectivity to a trail or a path in another development. I also think you need to figure out, you're talking about accessibility. I look at accessibility as not how do you get from one to another, but also
Ooh,
ADA compliant accessibility. And I'm like, you know, is a mulch walking path gonna,
yeah.
right? Everybody's like, no. So it's like, do we need to put some, but but are there other materials other than asphalt and concrete that would be appropriate? Because again, the maintenance is going to be either the city or most likely the HOA. So what works for them?
Mhm.
I actually had in another place, they did a grass walking path, and they delineated the walking path with some solar lights, and they kept that uh,
Oh,
mode to a lesser, a shorter height than the other grass. So I mean, you can typically get across on grass. It's to me a little bit easier than trying
Yeah.
to get through mulch. But I think those are some of the things we need to think about when we're looking at subdivisions as they come through. What is that walking path material made out of?
And I've seen people using, I'm not sure what it's called exactly. It's kind of a metal grid that goes down into the grass grows up between it, and you can, again, mow it low, but it's very easy to do a wheelchair or walk with a cane on. So
Yeah,
can
there's
we get,
at the botanical gardens in Washington, D.C., they have an outdoor space, and the it's not paved. It's those are called grasscrete, I think.
Mhm.
And instead of putting grass in them, they put gravel in it, and that's their handicap access, and it works fine as far as I know.
Mhm.
So there
Jan-
are other alternatives to doing asphalt, but again, asphalt is kind of the easiest.
Janelle, can we, oh, good, you're on to the next one.
I figured that's where you were going.
That's right. So the next area that I wanted us to discuss is kind of, are there special, some folks identify special inclusion criteria. That is, if there's a special feature, very mature trees, a scenic view or vista, or historic resources. And sometimes, in some cases, it's archaeological or some weird looking rock or stone. I mean, the mind boggles in terms of what these could be. And then they also sometimes include exclusions. So amongst exclusions, we've already talked about storm retention basins. Another one, though, is parking areas. And I have to say, it never occurred to me that you would consider a parking lot an open area. But
can't build a house on it.
yeah.
See, I could see that for like if you provide extra parking spaces for the clubhouse.
Mhm.
I think that's where they would count those, try to
Okay.
count that. So yeah, that's definitely something to consider.
So you're saying, Janelle, you would not include sort of the residential stuff, but where you had a certain number of spaces that you attributed to the clubhouse, you would include those in the open space calculation?
I'm saying I've seen that happen. It's
Okay.
up to you guys whether or not you want to count that. But some places, because it's associated with the clubhouse, that they would allow for that to be counted.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't know this slide was here. I know I asked questions that were right along these lines. So yeah, I mean, I think this is all really good stuff.
I feel like we already kind of covered this because
Yeah.
I think it's come up. So let's go to the next one, Janelle.
There we go. Sorry, it was sticking.
But this really comes in with uses. And I've given a whole series of examples of things that people sometimes call out specifically as a permitted use of an open space area. And so we've already talked about easements for sewer or water lines or right of way and said we were excluding those, I think. But, you know, outdoor recreation, you know, and BMPs for water management. Here we're not, obviously we're talking BMPs, not a water retention basin, but certain types of gardens or things like that that might be used. Other things like, you know, golf courses, I have a feeling we're not dealing with any subdivisions that would be large enough to include, you know, even an 8-hole golf course. And then for excluded uses, one thing that comes into play is how much of the open area you will permit to be covered by structures. So whether it's a clubhouse or a play structure or special fountains and things like that. Another excluded use typically is commercial operations, shooting ranges, or motorized vehicles. And I think here it's people using motorized vehicles on trails, et cetera. So any thought on any exclusions or inclusions?
Well, pasture land for animals, I believe livestock are prohibited in the city.
Mhm.
Is that right, Janelle?
Yeah, so whatever permitted uses are or are not, it would have to comply with whatever the zoning classification allows. But I think, you know, I think this gets like back to our bigger picture of uses of open space is if we create those two subcategories, that green space and that community open space, what uses fall into those, and then what ones do we want to exclude? Because I think, you know, for us, it would be, you know, how do we protect, you know, the woodlands, the existing mature trees, the wetlands, definitely uses of the open space, you know, and then, you know, for like the community, it would be that playground, that pickleball court. But I think things we definitely want to exclude would be, you know, the right of way, because that's really not what that is. And I think, you know, finding that just, you know, some uses. So I'm coming up with homework ideas. So
Yeah, so I mean, I just want to throw, I guess I haven't thought this through, so excuse me for this, but the last item on the uses of open space, the easements of sewer and water lines, I just have a little trouble with that one, but I mean, yeah, I think homework might allow refinement of that sense. I would hate to see, and I realize we're putting a lot of things together here. There are a lot of aspects of open space, but I wouldn't want even a small subdivision to have a considerable portion of its open space be occupied by these easements for sewer and water lines. But that's just to me kind of an obvious thing.
What problem do you think that presents on them? Everything's in the ground.
Maybe it's in by itself. It may be a problem, but it will be, my worry may be covered by some of the dimensional requirements we were kicking around a little while ago. I just don't want to get in the business of having a number of fairly thin linear spaces being added up as the open space area for the development.
So historically, most places, the good thing is your sewer and water easements are in your right of way. Every once in a while, you've got to run a line that goes across some open space, but it's still, think of it as there's grass on top of it, so it's just an easement to dig into it. So it could still be open space. The easement I think that we could end up seeing is probably stormwater management easements, because those sometimes will go into your open space to allow for that drainage. especially if you're going to slope slightly, put us like a swale behind the houses, which again, we get into our greener open space with some planting, and it depends on, again, how they develop it. But that could be back there. So I don't know if we want to, but I could see easements being in open space, and I've seen easements in open space, and also because it's like if you include the stormwater management pond as the green open space, you've got to have access to get there. So you're already putting an easement in. I think I wouldn't worry too much about the easements. I'd worry more about, what makes sense. What if we come up with a definition of an open space and then we subcategorize it, our green and our community, what uses fit into those categories?
Mhm. And then if we look at the next page, because I know we're running out of time here, and I wanted to just make sure we get through all the items. And this is really ownership and maintenance. And are there penalties for failure to maintain the open space? So I think in most situations, we're talking about a homeowners association taking over responsibility for maintenance, not the city, unless we actually have a park area somewhere that's being, turned over to the city with the city's agreement. And then it's interesting, some have put in place specific statements around the homeowners association not being permitted to lease the open land out. And it hadn't even occurred to me that a homeowners association would think of leasing the open land out, but obviously it does occur places, which is why it's been added.
So this might be for ultimate frisbee of some third party coming in on the weekends or whatever it might be. I mean, is that what you're talking about?
Well, I think the way I was looking at how these were written, it sounded more like they were leasing it out to someone who might actually operate a commercial, business on it.
Right.
Yeah, good rock concert.
So not just a weekend frisbee contest, but this is where we have ultimate frisbee set up, and you pay $5 at the gate, and you can, do it.
Well, the good thing is the city code prohibits that use in the residential districts.
Okay, good.
What use?
Because then you're running a commercial entity, and that's just
commercial use.
Yeah, even though because the minute, I try to rent out my backyard for, for a putt something, for, putting green, I'm like, I've now got a commercial use going on in my backyard, which I'm not, by the way. But yeah, that triggers you've got a business going on, which would not be permitted.
Okay.
And then we do have penalties with code enforcement. So just like other things, there are requirements that they have to, maintain that. And, and I think there's always something that we could put into code that I know other places have had is like, when do we require the active recreation, that community to be open space to be constructed? At what point in the subdivision? Because we definitely want it, it's like, okay, if we got a 300 lot subdivision, I'm just throwing out numbers, we don't want to get all the way out to lot 299 built before we even get, the walking path in. So think about, what steps it makes sense to, put in some, like, so much of the open space or the active community open space has to be constructed at what time.
Yeah.
Does it make any sense to tie that to the conveyance of to the homeowners association of the common lands? I mean, is that too tidy? Normally there's a similar threshold. I don't know if it's the same number, where the developer hands over the common lands to the homeowners association, or where it recognizes the homeowners association.
Yeah, that would have to be done. But I think at some point maybe we want that built before it gets turned over. So and I think sometimes they just want to also go like, hey, you want to buy a house here? Look at all these pretty amenities. But I think it's finding that balance that as you go along, a percentage of your amenities are installed. We did get a question: if you want to provide an incentive to HOAs, you can waive real estate taxes on the open space, make them tax free. That is not something we have control over that I am aware of. That is a mayor and council decision. When you're starting to talk about land use and taxes. So just keeping that, I don't think the commission has, I think that's beyond your purview.
I assume that's something if we wanted to kind of recommend or suggest that council consider it, we could do.
You could.
Yeah.
You can't get them out of the county's taxes.
Mhm.
But yeah, you could consider that. But again, I think that's maybe getting a bit beyond your purview.
Okay.
But I agree with that, but I have to say, just in case this doesn't come up ever again, but if we were to make such a recommendation, I would want to be conditioning it on some sort of public access to it.
Mhm. Yeah. So the attempt here was to go through, looking at how others have looked at open space, what are the factors they consider, and to kind of give us like this long shopping list of things to consider and have a discussion around it. I don't think there's an expectation that we would come out of this with a written ordinance or a definition of open space. But I feel like we've given, hopefully, Janelle, you enough to go away and start drafting something. And I don't know about you, Sumner, or you, Melanie, but I'm thinking we try to get down how we would like to see this, and then approach it from, okay, how are we operationalizing it? Is it the kind of list you're talking about, or point system, or trade-offs, or whatever? If we can first get agreement on how we want to describe and what we're counting as open space.
I think that's right. I have to say, at a couple points through your slides, Nancy, and thank you, they were excellent slides. Well done.
Thank you.
I found myself wondering just what kind of appetite Parks and Rec would have for, at least what I imagine of these connected developments, a network of paths that sort of traverses a whole bunch of neighborhoods. Maybe that's not something, I mean, Janelle, did they ever talk about that?
I can reach out to the parks administrator and see if she's got a sense. But I also think it's sometimes I'm trying to think, not the incentive. The reason you want to move there is because these are your amenities, these are your uses. But I think, again, and then is there an appetite for the city to create an even larger park system? I think we have to find that balance.
That's why I asked that question.
And I don't know. They just increased the number of Parks and Rec commissioners by 2 for the new areas for the beaches, and then one does it specifically for the Great Marsh Park. So I'm not sure if because that actually requires a code change if we're adding more parks and creating new ones. But I can talk to her and see if there's how they're feeling and if they've ever considered it.
Well, and it may be that, I only learned a little while ago that there used to be a Greenways and Trails Committee. It was headed by Nina Kanata. It hasn't met in a while, but, I guess I'm imagining sort of that Greenways and Trails system of connections between the parks. Having spent more time on my bicycle lately, trying to imagine reducing my demand for parking in and around the city of Lewis. I'm always looking for better ways to traverse the city. And I guess that's part of the reason why I keep pushing this connected nature, this connected network. But that's just me.
And I think that's maybe something we look at just dedicated bike lanes for city streets and continue to work with DelDOT for their multimodal paths. Because a lot of those connections you can make along the streets. And especially since the way the city has built out, I think it's going to be hard to make a lot of those connections through the developments, because I think they just weren't built there in the first place.
But there are other properties, particularly, I would say, in the annexation areas that run out a major road like New Road. But there's opportunity to cut perpendicular to those major roads like New Road or Savannah Road to make connections between them. And I guess that's the spirit I'm thinking of this. It may be difficult, but I guess I'm just hoping that we can explore those possibilities as we're working through some of these.
And
Maybe
I mean,
that's
my perspective, certainly I think we want to encourage interconnected paths, and I would hope those paths were open to the general public. I fully understand that when you have a homeowners association and you're paying to, maintain a gazebo, that you want to be, as a homeowner, you want to have access to use that when you want, and you don't want to kind of see, a gazillion people who don't help support that using it every day. But the path that you're maintaining, it's not a big, I don't think that the extra person walking across it and you have the ability then to use the path next door to your property certainly is the fair trade-off. So
that's exactly what I'm thinking.
Yeah, and I'm thinking maybe that can be one of those superior design criteria, is you're going to provide that connection to another development. Yeah. So I wrote that one down on under there. So because to me, that is definitely a superior idea to try to get that extra connection.
I have a hard stop at 3:30, which may explain my moving a little bit right now. So.
Okay, so
I'd like to make one more suggestion before we go. I think that in terms of trying to figure out incentives, that maybe we should invite a developer to our next meeting and try to get some input from a developer as to what they would consider an incentive, because what we may consider incentive, they may say, oh, that's nothing,
Are we going to be ready in the next meeting to do that, or do we need more time to sort of put that together? I agree with that, Melanie. I just don't know if we're there yet. I mean, what do you think, guys?
So
I agree with it, Melanie. But I would almost think if we give it a little, another meeting and then maybe have not just one developer, but if we could invite a panel of 2 or 3, because I assume like us, they may not all agree. And so getting a few perspectives.
Or maybe we just invite them to be a committee member.
Well, but I like what Nancy's saying.
So
I actually think that we should be talking with a bunch of people.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think homework is I'll work on definitions. You guys please send me your ideas of what you think should be in the open space definition, and then that passive green space items and that community open space active items. And if you've got ideas for like superior criteria, send them to me. And then I'm going to send out an email, because I know you've got a hard stop in like less than a minute, about setting up the next meeting in probably 2 weeks. And then I'm going to see, I'm going to try and find some developers, and maybe I'll just have a conversation and see what they're thinking, and then invite them to the next meeting.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. And I apologize again for not being here at the beginning of the meeting. That is not the way I operate. I'm so sorry. I had the wrong date on my calendar.
It's Monday. It's all good.
Is it really Monday? Thank you very much. Nancy, thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.